Well, hello again. Let's try this again. How's everybody today? I am back. You know me as Ziggy Salvation, and I just wanted to welcome everybody to the Baron's Chat podcast. This is week number 8 for us. So far, so good. I hope everyone's enjoying it, getting some really good feedback. And this time I'm taking it to a little bit of a two-part. Yeah, we're going to talk about two races, should I say, that are small and stout, but rather annoying in certain aspects, but they're also pretty clever. But there's not a whole lot we know about them. This, of course, would be Troggs and the Kobolds. Troggs are the guys, you know, if you ever ran Alderman. Little Neanderthal caveman looking guys, they're pretty brutal, right? They got like this big jaw, big forehead, and they're the little cave dwellers. You know, they're originally, believe it or not, descendants of the first type of Titan forged manufactured races over in the Forge of Wills. They're kind of known for their low intelligence, but they often come into certain conflicts with a very distant relative of theirs, believe it or not, which is the dwarf. So, following a war back with the old gods, right? Titan Forge Keepers set to work this on creating this new generation by using the Forge of Wills. But however, their initial designs proved a little too complex. The result was the first stone skin brutes, kind of known as what we now know as the Troggs. Okay, they were kind of distressed by these little savage, little wicked creatures, and then the Keepers refined their design a little bit, resulting in an earthen race. Okay, so the Keepers couldn't really bring themselves to destroy their already existing defective creations, and instead, the giantess, Aranya, created the Vault of Alderman to serve kind of as like a dome or a stasis chamber for them to live in. However, some Troggs later on managed to escape this vault and began wandering around the world. One group somehow managed to make their way all the way to into Deepholm through Alderman, more than 15,000 years ago. Troggs were not really afflicted by the curse of flesh. So unlike their cousins over in Azeroth, they're kind of known as stone Troggs, the true form, if you will, of the Troggs. During the reign of the Mogu Empire, Emperor Tian encountered Troggs and kind of needed messages and delivery men. He warped the Troggs using flesh shaping, enhancing their strength, smell, and sense of direction, creating the first Grummels. You know, anyone who doesn't say, you know, they say we haven't seen a Grumble. If you've ever seen anybody on the Expedition Yak, and you hear the quippy little guy talking about how he can sell you all these little trinkets and treasures, that is a Grumble. So for typical Troggs, right, buried deep within the earth, they slept underground for thousands of years until their cousins, the dwarves, that's right, I said it, the dwarves, kind of excavated these Titan strongholds, like Alderman. But once they were disturbed, the Troggs poured out of the ground, here to take out their aggression on their distant dwarven cousins, but they would gleefully slaughter any dwarven explorers, and they would be forcing the survivors to flee back to Ironforge. The dwarves were kind of relieved to find that the Troggs didn't pursue them, but in truth, they were still hunting them from underground, and they would carve these tunnels through the core and through the crust of the earth, and they would near Ironforge, right? And the artificial noises that were kind of made by the great factories over in Nomergon kind of caught their attention. So the Troggs kind of burrowed into the lowest levels of Nomergon, and we can see that's still true to this day, because anytime you go into the instance, if you drop to the bottom past the elemental, as you're weaving through, I believe they're the first mob that you encounter in the dungeon. So encountering these little gnomes, which are smaller and weaker than the Troggs, they had, kind of earned and taken their place in the depths of Nomergon. But it was High Tinker, what was his name, Gelbin Mekatork, right? He organized defenses to hold the invaders at bay. But the Troggs were always using their nails and teeth to kind of repeatedly burrow through and bypass around the defenses. Therefore, the Troggs kind of continued besieging Nomergon throughout the entire Third War. And despite their ingenuity, the gnomes were kind of massively outnumbered and really couldn't hold them back. They eventually dug into the engineering quarters, cut the gnomes off in their best invention, and placing these dangerous and unstable materials into the hands of these really primitive, simple-minded creatures. There was this trader, right? We all know him as Sicko Thermoplug. He convinced, believe it or not, Mekatork to bathe the overrun sections in the city in lethal radiation to kill off the Troggs. In some way, the radiation was meant to anger the Troggs and kill the gnomes, and in a few days, the radiation wiped out nearly 80% of the entire gnomish population, kind of forcing the survivors to flee to Ironforge. Which is why, if you guys remember back up until recently, up until the gnome starting zone, gnomes and dwarves kind of started together in the same zone. And that's pretty much why. But then during the Cataclysm, there was an earthquake, right? Everyone remembers the Great Earthquake. It destroyed the home of the Troggs known as the Rockjaws. They were over in Coldridge Valley. Believing that the dwarves were responsible for this earthquake, Rockjaws came to the surface in numbers that were never really seen before. They kind of lashed out their anger in the nearby dwarves of Anvilmar. So you have these massive waves of Troggs that also forced the Frostmourne tribe, which were the Ice Trolls, to move east, which also kind of started the whole ordeal in Keranos. There was a whole huge struggle. There was a large amount of Troggs in Loch Modan that were also enslaved by who we're talking about later, the Kobolds. They kind of were loyal to the Axes of Valful, right? The Kobold Geomancers, which are their spellcasters, managed to create some kind of parlor trick to kind of control these guys, as the Troggs are, ultimately the creatures of Earth. Even though Troggs are powerfully built, with their huge muscle arms hanging almost to the front, almost to the ground, they have some really vague similarities to dwarves. And they got the shaggy beards, they got the stout, sort of thing going. They got these thick bands of muscle that appear to have been carved almost from rock. However, that's where the similarities end. But they also tend to be sloped almost like an ape posture, kind of with the heavy brow ridge, and they have these really pronounced canines of a predator, right? They have jagged, bony growths in their shoulders and their elbows, and it's kind of a true testament to their, no pun intended, well, maybe a little bit, their rocky heritage. But they also have heavy minerals in their physiology. Troggs are known for their foul smell, which resembles a mixture of mold or a sour monkey, a little dash of mange, which just sounds awesome. But Troggs are also much larger and physically stronger than gnomes. It can be easily twice the size. There's one Trogg per 5 gnomes, assuming that they're armed and they have experience in subterranean warfare. Force of will and a strong sense of cunning are really the only driving factors in the psyche of the Trogg, because they're darn well known to engage in cannibalism. They consume stone and anything they can shove into their maw, including other Troggs. Like, don't let this get twisted, they'll eat anything. Troggs value strength, more so than anything. So, kind of like the gnolls when we were talking about them. The biggest, strongest, and most vicious Trogg often becomes chieftain through displays of power, which we see more and more through the races. It's kind of a theme with the races that don't. They're intelligent, but not necessarily verbal, right? So just because these guys are so strong and powerful doesn't mean they're of the highest intelligence where they can organize to a greatest extent. So even though they're cunning in battle, usually don't possess the higher intelligence. Instead, they kind of depend on the ferocity and their tough skin to kind of see them through. They're really resilient to a lot of things that oppose them. Most of them are vicious fighters, but some of the slightly more intelligent can cast the occasional spell. Even though most Troggs absolutely loathe traveling above ground, and instead prefer to use their, themselves to dig through the tunnels, and some of them are known to actually collect and look for the old Titan artifacts. And some luminaries in Ironforge's prestigious, Explorers League have pointed out that the behavior is a reflection of the dwarves' own kind of reverence for such wondrous little devices. Even though they're kind of these exquisite specimens of engineering, they're nearly indistinguishable from simple rocks. And most of them have like this advanced craftsmanship ability that can apparently take the form of using rocks as tools. So Troggs are also known historically to are the ones that kind of developed axes and arrows and even really rudimentary spoons, as funny as this sounds. But if you look at the words of what's his High Examiner Ithalon, Blood Watcher, he was not so hasty as to overlook them, because even though they're simple, they know things about the deep hidden places in the world. The creature that's, they're, if you look at them, they're kind of a grotesque parody of a dwarf. They kind of have this crude, hide that smells, and they carry this really rugged club that's usually almost always stained with blood, because God knows what they killed last. But what's the maliciously cunning and apparent about them is they have these deep, beady eyes. They're distinctly Neanderthal in appearance, so they're really, you can see that when the Titans saw how brutal and misshapen the Troggs were, they buried them themselves in the vaults. That's the area that we now know as Khazmodan, right? The main vault of Troggs is in the Titan city, Alderman. That's the big hub. But to say that they were scrapped and then the Titans made their second try, it's kind of like revamping a toy. They've seen what was wrong with it, put it away, kind of admit it never happened, and say, here's this better version. And that's where we got the dwarves from. It's a race that, even though they're primitive, they have deep roots, So being that they're so brutal and they're vicious to this, they're usually barbarians. Warriors are common, but not really. And then there's sometimes, which are even less common, are rogues. But really, the only casting classes that we know, believe it or not, they're healers. They're either elemental shaman or there's some kind of priests. They have healing capabilities. The arcane casters are wholly, as a complete package, completely unknown among the Troggs. Just like neither are tinkers. Some scholars kind of argue that with proper education, a Trogg can learn such skills. But as far as anyone knows, no one's tried to bother teaching them. While a hunter might seem to be a logical class, that class is also super rare among them. So apparently these creatures lack the patience required for animal handling. They'd rather just eat them. So you see, this adventuring Trogg isn't an impossibility, but they'd have many objectives to overcome. The primary ones being stupidity in language, simply. Troggs are almost completely nonverbal. They smell weird, they kind of grunt at each other as far as communication, and it's enough to get the point across of the task that they're trying to perform. But if there was a Trogg that can somehow get past these little social stigmas, they would be an exceptional individual. Culture-wise, Troggs worship this massive reptiles known as salamanders. So salamander, you think you don't really see the word salamander, but in the lore aspect of it, a salamander is a thunder lizard, or a Kodo that shoots lightning. Whatever way you want. Kodos themselves can be sort of a thunder lizard-ish. So what they'll do is they'll attempt to capture and train young versions of them as mounts. And if the primitive humanoids slay one, or encounter a slain one, they'll feast on his remains and make crude weapons and armor from his claws, his teeth, his hide. And kind of that's how they keep their whole society going. They have that one figurehead. But because they grunt, bellow to get their messages across, the ones with the exceptional intelligence can learn how to speak low common. The truly gifted ones might learn common or even enough dwarven to get by. But even more rare are the Troggs that can use dwarven or common as their primary language. And they're out there. It's not a very heard of thing, and the ones that do typically stay together. Before their origin as the first generation of Titan Forge to be manufactured, you can see several older sources. They kind of imply that the Troggs were a direct result of the earthen being afflicted by the curse of flesh. Bronzebeard, the little dwarf, the explorer league we all know, has theorized that Kobolds evolved from Troggs. And Trogg, the word Trogg itself comes from the word troglodyte, meaning caveman. The model name for Troggs is troglodyte. So despite actually being directly related to dwarves, there's never really been a witness transformation from dwarf to Trogg. It's kind of the case of Feegly the Exiled, right? Several members of the Horde assisted him in acquiring a relic of the Titans, which they excavated from an archaeological dig in Belmadan, but in the southern breaches of the Barrens. But after receiving the item in his desire, Feegly kind of produced, kind of rubbed the artifact like the One Ring, named by the dwarves the Tear of the Moons. So Feegly was transformed into one of the fearsome Troggs. Afterwards, he died moments later, and the Tear of Moons fell to the ground and broke and kind of left no trace of this mysterious jewel that they wanted to have studied. Some of the dwarves kind of consider the Troggs to be mutants also. Warash, who was an ogre mage, he was one of the Spirestone clan, right? Until he challenged Uruk Doomhowl. Uruk stole the mojo and then cursed Warash into the form of a Trogg. So because they're of the earth, any earth elemental magic can, and if powerfully used enough, can be used to manipulate your enemies into almost setting them back to a Trogg. So while stone Troggs have separate models, forged iron Troggs use normal Trogg models. They were first introduced to Hearthstone, the Goblinverse Gnomes expansion. Many Trogg cards gain power whenever an enemy spell is cast, and this is meant to be in representation of their low intelligence and inability to learn magic. And they therefore have become angered when spells are cast near them. So if they see that you're smarter than them by casting magic, you're more or less walking away with an enemy. In the League of the Explorers adventure, a giant Trogg called Chieftain Scarvash serves as the first boss, and in our adventure, the second wing of Alderman. So being, enslaved by the Kobolds, and the fact that the Kobolds evolved from Troggs, even though it's not ever really been proven, the Kobolds have a whole separate history on their own. They're kind of this race of these little diminutive, rat-like, also subterranean humanoids, kind of dwell in and around caverns and mines throughout the entire Eastern Kingdoms, Kalimdor, and Broken Isles. They've kind of gotten everywhere. They're not particularly intelligent and are pretty notoriously being cowards, but preferring to keep their distance from other larger races. Kobolds are more famous for being obsessively protective of their candles that they wear on top of their heads. It kind of helps them light their way through their dark tunnels as they all come home. There's also a race of Arctic kobolds known as the snowbolds, believe it, and funny enough, they kind of make their home all the way up in Northrend. So that's already a adaptation right there. If you look at the history of the kobolds, you got Bronzebeard again, who's kind of theorized being from, they're evolving from Troggs, but around the year 2700, BDP, before the Dark Portal. Kobolds were among the threats of early human settlers facing terrestrial blades. During the construction of the Orcish city of Orgrimmar, the goblin workers under the command of Gazlo, started dredging out tunnels beneath the city in search for underground wells. But in doing so, they kind of dug straight into a kobold den. Therefore, along the rat freaks, as Gazlo liked to call them, overran these goblin tunnels. Rexar, our favorite, half orc, half ogre dude, adventurer, protector, whatever you want to call him, he helped the goblins seal up the kobolds by escorting goblin sappers into the tunnel. They would bring in the support beams kind of away from everyone. Where if you look into High Mountain, the kobolds are of what they call the Candle Rock in High Mountain. They lived in peace until the Drogbar took their caverns. But the Drogbar were swallowed whole by this devouring darkness, and the cavern became theirs again. So the kobolds were protected from the darkness of the caves by the candles on their heads, which is why when you engage with one of the first few things they scream at you is, "You don't take candle." Like they take it completely serious. If you talk to Spirit Walker Ebonhorn, the darkness, the kobold fear, is called Ulganeth. That's kind of their word for it. Kobolds aren't particularly bright, but they're considered more of an annoyance than a true danger. But they also breed like rabbits, and they can always found in large numbers wherever they dwell. They're only about 4 foot tall, at best. And even though they have excellent vision in low light conditions, the darkest recesses of mines and caves, they still need a source of light in order to be able to see. Hence, again, the reliable, of the candles that they have on top of their head, which is funny to think about. Stabbing the candle in your head and lighting it, let the wax of the candle kind of melt to your head. When a group of kobolds is agitated, they whip their tails back and forth. And because they're subterranean and rat-like, we all know they stink horribly, regardless of whether or not they are alive or dead. It's also said that for every kobold you see, there are at least 100 more. So you can definitely see the direct influence of the real world being these rat-like creatures with the tunneling and the smelling and this and that, to see where the reference of rat people really comes from. Kobold clans of High Mountain use skulls to designate their leadership. Even though they're unintelligent enough to believe that a non-kobold to be their leader is they're wearing a skull, kobolds outside of the Broken Isles appear to instead identify leaders based on who has the longest candle. I love how these races come up with their hierarchy, because it proves they're intelligent, but not too threateningly intelligent. As far as the candles go, they don't, you would think being so subterranean they'd have nocturnal sight, but they don't. They rely on these candles, which is why they're so important, because they use them to traverse through these mines that has become their home. But Kobold legends also speak of these dark, devouring presence deep in the caverns of High Mountain, which is a reason for them to fear the dark. The blue wax of a Candle Rock kobold frequently mentions that if their candle goes out, or if they lack a candle altogether, the darkness will eat them. There's a Blue Axe historian named Kip Brightwick. He tells about how the Blue Axe were once forced out of their home by a group of the Drogbar who claimed the cavern as their own. But the Drogbar didn't have candles, so the darkness began to follow them until it finally swallowed them all in one shot. So because they had their candles, they stayed safe, and that's how they moved back in. If you take a circle of 6 large candles, place them in the eastern part of Candle Rock, If the adventurer extinguishes the flames of all 6 candles, a large void wraith called the Devouring Darkness will appear to attack you. That's in the game right now. You can see it for yourself. However, the true darkness they feared is Ulganeth, who is the herald of the dark gods. So there's definitely some play between the two. I think the grossest part about these candles is how they're made. First thing you're probably thinking is, okay, there's this little rat dude who just suddenly has an abundance of candles. How did he get this thing? Well, that's because the kobolds use fresh earwax. They find it to be the best material for making these candles. They also use wax to wax off extra hairs to make drip baths. A little tidbit for you didn't need to know. The blue wax kobolds are also known to keep rats as both pets and a source of food. So the critters that are not afraid of darkness, the kobolds fear, and they make good diggers, or good dinner if not. So they can kind of see their companions as both a friend or foodstuffs. Unless they bite. If they, if their little rat companion bites them, they're instantaneously a meal. Additionally, but not limited, they are apparently both tastier and easier to catch than rabbits. So there's good food for thought. But being kobolds are a little bit higher of intelligence, and they do have, common language. Kobolds, though simple, are most only capable of earth magic, right? They have a few that are preferred a rather nasty fireball, but really that's all you really see them hurl at each other. Their ranks are kind of also known to contain, rarely, pyromancers. Following the Cataclysm, the Geomancers of the Tunnel Rat group, right, a colony loyal to the Axis of Awful, managed to figure out how some kind of parlor trick to, that I mentioned before that kind of made them Troggs, ultimately considered, creatures of the earth, that made them their slaves. But most kobolds are warriors, skilled with their little mining picks. Their style of fighting kind of involves attacking with as many allies as possible, a very tact mentality, which by then, they kind of beat you to death with the pickaxes, and kind of, they more so offend you to death because they're killing you with paper cuts because they're so small in stature. They're mining picks. How big can they really be? So as you're chasing down with these hordes of numbers, you're just getting picks and pokes and prods all over the place. But if you ask, Lasan Skyhorn, kobolds are very poor at mining. So they just kind of waste a lot of their time in what they feel is this huge presence in the dwelling world, but really it takes them forever to really get anywhere. Kobolds, believe it or not, even though here's some hierarchy for you. The Troggs get enslaved by the kobolds. So you think, okay, they're smart enough, even though they're small, to do some damage. That being said, the kobolds have also been known to be enslaved by our friends the gnolls. They kind of force the little rat-like humans to an existence of really never-ending drudgery. And since their enslavement, these historically meek kobolds have grown bitter and aggressive toward, any creature that comes in meddles with their little ceaseless behavior of labor. Incredibly enough, though, Kobold clans have successfully forged these ties with, of all creatures of Azeroth, the Harpies. In High Mountain, some kobolds often stolen and scavenged trinkets. Oftentimes, it would be broken or worthless to anyone else, but the Harpies provide this protection for their offerings of obedience. But other kobolds simply train, they're sitting there trading each other what they call their shinies to the Harpies in exchange for fresh earwax to make more candles, because that's their primary focus of who's got that bigger candle. In Northrend, the giant magnitors have kindly become strangely tolerant to the Arctic kobolds, or snowbolts, who kind of follow the magnitor herds for safety and mutual benefit during these long hunts. It reminds me of, a rhinoceros with a bird, or a hippopotamus with a bird. Tiny, yet somewhat helpful. and this kind of a symbiotic relationship. But ever since, you know, the theft of the Hammer of Khaz'goroth, Kobolds of High Mountain really become a little bit more prolific and have now become this noticeable nuisance to the High Mountain Torrent, who kind of once thought them to be nothing. And, you know, they kind of saw them as an overgrown rat with a tunic. But the Blue Axe kind of began raiding Sepulchre of the Sky, and even infiltrating Thundertone itself to steal ceremonial drums. While the Skywhisker clan kind of allied themselves with the Kraliak Harpies to assault Skyhorn. One of my favorite things about the Kobolds is because they date back, obviously forever, but game-wise, because they date back all the way to vanilla, they kind of, up until World of Warcraft, we all know that aside from the StarCraft thing in Korea going on and the phenomenon that was happening over there, and still does today, Diablo was their big franchise. Kobolds, believe it or not, every once in a while, for the fans of Blizzard that have been around as long as I have, know that when sometimes you hear the voice lines, they yell a very big Easter egg word, that being Rakanishu. Rakanishu is, you know, what are they called in Diablo 2? The little carvers. Fallen, there we go. They look like kobolds, but they look like little demons. The one that you have to kill in order to open the stones to rescue Deckard Cain, his name is in fact Rakanishu. And all those little carvers and all those little fallen also say that exact same voice phrase. So to hear that in WoW coming from an 11-year Diablo career was awesome. It was really the first Easter egg I noticed in the game, and that was 18 years ago. There are a ton of different Kobold clans, and like I said, they vary literally on every continent of Azeroth. You got the White Whiskers, you got the Tunnel Rats, there's that nameless Elwyn clan that kind of hang around with the Defiance Brotherhood, and that's, you know, Goldtooth you see outside the Jasper Lode mines. You have the Blue Axe, like we've mentioned a lot, because they're probably the most prominent as far as organization. But in High Mountain, you also have the Gold Snuffle, Dunk Snouts, the Muck Snouts, and the Candle Rock, which is also home of the Blue Axe. Kobolds, even though they're little humanoids and they're afraid to venture into anything of light, they kind of fear their own shadows, much like most rats if anybody's ever owned one. But backed into a corner, and they will fight death. Appearance-wise, they stand between 3 and 4 foot. So that means they're about, 70 to 100 pounds, and they're wiry. It kind of bears much a resemblance to a rat as it does to a humanoid, and kind of move with this rapid little hunched gait to them. Its nervousness is evident in its large rodent-like eyes, but because they're so small and they have their long snout, little white hairs poke from beneath this little, you know, ragged cap. So on purpose, it was, you know, they use that little hair to kind of ground their little awesome earwax candles to kind of light their way. The mining pick is usually over its right shoulder because they're for some reason predominantly right-handed, and they have the side-eye thing, so they're always, you can tell they're prey. They're always looking around. But Kobolds form these loose clans kind of based on bloodline, right? There's nothing, they don't have anything like a marriage. They don't have, you know, anything as far as social protocol about how to procreate. But the young individuals kind of migrate between nests or between the larger warrens. And Kobolds of all ages prefer to sleep in large groups to not only keep warmth, but to also have protection. So even though there's no overt structure of government, they kind of organize in these loose groups to plan out digs or scavenging. And even though they're not particularly bright, they have keen senses, and they have kind of these little good abilities to read a situation. One of their significant accomplishments is that with their alliance to the Harpies, Kobolds offer their equipment, so they kind of protect one another in proximity. Kobolds will avoid combat at all possibility, but that's why they have their traps, and they gather small food for animals to protect their warrens. But when they're pressed for it, they'll flood over the target, and they'll bite you at any vulnerable point. But when they're facing a significant threat, they'll kind of abandon their nests and their young, if it came down to it. They have kind of this knack for stealth and comfort in underground, even though you do occasionally see them in Westfall, especially above ground. A lot of the kobolds that you see also, which is hilarious to me, they wear helmets, and they even put a candle on top of the helmet. They're more of a light source than anything, because you have the protection and you still have, a place to put your candle. But knowing that they are smarter, we can completely confirm that they speak low common and common, but they also kind of adapt to learn the language of their, what they would consider their big scary neighbors. So they have the ability to manipulate speech if they're around it enough to pick it up. But they prefer to remain among their own kind, because they're so afraid of the world and the light and the races that kind of live everywhere that isn't with them. They're comfortable in the mines, chipping away at their picks, even though they're not that good at it, but just being generally weak. But it's funny because they deal with these frightening numbers. And even though they have gifted, these gifted fighters, there's still really no match because of their weakness for any other race, which is why you don't see them posing significant threats. Most kobolds have like this wanderlust that they can't otherwise satiate. They feel this pull of riches more keenly than their brethren, and realize that adventures might be the best way to get what they need. Friendly kobolds are possibly raised by the night elves or some other race, because they're ruled by fear. Heroic kobolds emerge from time to time, but rarely. So if you imagine being a kobold and then you see an elf that shows you some kind of magic or some kind of giant weapon that's 3 times their size, why do what you tell them to do? A little bit of trivia. The word kobold, believe it or not, is actually a German word. It's a word that means sprite. And there's a particular sprite or type of kobold that's said to dwell in the mines where they cause accidents such as cave-ins and rock slides in good old German lore. But as far as the speculation of them goes, there's an article that kind of observes or gives opinions supported by the lore of WoW, or of Blizzard, should I say, and it's not really been taken yet to the official lore, but there's an evidence that kobolds have a possible primordial connection to the beings of Azeroth, evidenced by their own involvement in the imprisonment of the elemental princess Misrael over in the Arathi Highlands. But they may or may not have a connection to their Trogg ancestry. The two of them are very intertwined, and because they have such massive numbers, there are things in the game that we come across often. I don't know, every time I learn about or think about a certain race, even if I know about it or not, constant wonderment of the game itself is coming across these and knowing that each little race or animal or lore named character has such a huge history behind them. Pretty darn interesting for 18 years at it. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the talk. That's kind of really all I have on the two of them. But it's more than you ever would have thought of. Because any other time going through the quest, reading the storyline, the Troggs took this, or the Kobolds took that. Go take 8 candles from them, go take 8 pickaxes from them. But they've been around. Hopefully, there's no evolution that makes them more formidable. But I'd say, push come to shove, I definitely fear the Troggs more than I would the Kobolds. That being said, I hope I see you guys next week. I think we're gonna take it back to the polls again about what to talk about next. I kind of want to touch on the Fel Orcs, the guys out in, well, we call it Outland now, but the planet that was originally Draenor. They're the first ones you see when you come across the original Dark Portal. They got the spines and they're red. They're right there in Hellfire, the Hellfire Peninsula. But there's a couple others I'm going to throw on Twitter. So if you guys have the time, check out the Twitter for the podcast itself at good old fashioned. It's go to twitter.com, or you can just type in @Barons Podcast. And I'll see you guys next week. Thanks a lot for everything. Have a good week. If I don't see you because you're traveling, whatnot, be safe this holiday season. Have a good holiday, whether it's Christmas or Hanukkah or in our house, Christmas. I will see you guys next week. Take it easy.